course. So yeah, that was nice of it starting. So quite sure. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, time zone dependent. And welcome to Ladies Be Architects 6th Platform App Builder study session and our second flow study session. So this one's going to be split into 2 pieces again this week and next week, where we start to dive into advanced flow a little bit more. I'm going to pop to the next slide. Let Vickie introduce herself.
Hi everyone, my name is Vickie Jeffery. I'm Head of Technology at a company called Oshaw here in Brisbane. And I've been with Ladies Be Architects for a few years now. Still doing the architect track myself, so I'm onto the systems architect and studying in integration architecture at the moment.
Awesome. And I'm Adrienne Cutcliffe. I'm the not-for-profit solutions lead for ANZ, Traction on Demand. So we're a consulting partner, mostly globally. Like Vickie, I actually also in the last 12 months got my application architect certification, so I'm a certified application architect, and I'm also working my way through the system architect side as well.
Okay, so who are we? So Ladies Be Architects has been around for 3 or 4 years now. Started by Gemma, who's in the UK, and quickly followed by Charlie and Susanna, who are also passionate about architecture, and then joined more recently, which was probably actually 2 or 3 years ago itself, by myself, Adrienne, and Emily down here in Australia to encourage everyone across the globe, including APAC, to look at this path.
Awesome. So no big surprises here. It's the same session, the last session, the same session for the next 2 sessions. But just as a refresher for those who haven't joined us before, what we originally set off doing at the beginning of this year was working through the Platform App Builder certification to really give some good resources and to take people into it at a deeper level. So we've covered a majority of other sessions, which you can check out on our YouTube channel, such as sharing, data management, some of the other sort of flows, mobile actions, chatter actions, etc. And now we're on to flows and process automation. You would have noticed in that previous slide that it does specify, given a scenario, determine the capabilities and use cases for flow and process builder. But due to the announcement at Dreamforce this year that flow and workflow, so process builder and workflow will be retired in the kind of coming year or 2, and they are going to start giving you migration tools to flow. We thought it very pertinent to focus on flow for these sessions because it's where the platform is moving towards.
So our first session, with these are all the things that we covered, and you're able to go and view the slides as well as the webinar on the Ladies Be Architects website. So I won't go through them, but that's where you can get all the information about those. Today we're going to cover flow types, so the more advanced flow types around platform event triggered and auto-launched, launching flows, with Visualforce custom components, Apex, subflows, REST APIs. We're actually going to cover next best actions next time, I think. We may have briefly covered it in this one. Subflow interaction elements, some user system context topics, and security transactions, finished behavior, debugging and monitoring, error handling, bulkification, and Adrienne will be doing a demo.
Awesome.
And then next week, we've got some more. So I won't go through these, but do join us next week for some even more advanced demos and topics. Okay, so if we jump in, last time we covered the first 3, screen flow, record triggered flow, and schedule triggered flow. This time we're going to cover platform event triggered flow and the auto launched, no trigger.
Sorry, I do just want to say that if anyone has any questions throughout the session, please feel free to pop them in the chat while Vickie's talking. And while Vickie's talking, I will respond to comments. While I'm talking, Vickie will respond to comments. And if we don't get to them all, we will respond to them at the end. But just so that you don't need to hold it until the very end to ask your questions.
Okay, so our first flow type, platform event triggered flow. So a platform event it's really similar to an object. I'm not going to go through and explain exactly what a platform event is because it would take quite a long time, but it's really used to integrate with external systems. So an external system can subscribe to a platform event in Salesforce when it's created, and flows can be triggered by platform events when they come in from an external system into Salesforce. So you can set a flow going by creating a platform event triggered flow. And as I said, they can either be subscribed to or created from. And you can also set a pause element to restart when a platform event is received. Now, an auto-launched flow, so these are our no triggers. So no trigger means that these are launched when something hasn't happened in the database, but more that you've set it to go by using REST API, Apex, or Visualforce, or something like that. While an auto-launched flow is when something has happened, so an update or a create has happened in Salesforce to launch that flow. So with the auto-launched flow no trigger, we're going to cover off launch types of REST API, Apex, Visualforce, custom buttons, custom links. You can also put them in web tabs. There's no user interaction. So as I said, you're not creating or updating. These don't support screens, so you can't use auto-launch flows inside a screen flow, or local actions, which we'll be covering next session. And you can't use choices or choice sets in these auto-launched flows.
I'm on mute. So with that being said, you can actually pass a screen flow to an auto-launched flow and back, but you can't have screens within an auto-launched flow. So we'll get to subflows a little bit later.
Okay, so what are we going to be covering with launching flows? So we'll cover Visualforce. Platform event triggered flows, we've just really covered that in the previous slide, so we won't be using another slide, having another slide for that. So platform event is really triggered when you receive a platform event or when Salesforce receives a platform event. And we'll also be covering the auto launch flow, so Apex Process Builder. We've put Process Builder is in there because we need to cover that for an item. REST API, flow URL, and subflow. Adrienne. On to you, Adrienne.
Sorry, I clicked the unmute button and my computer was in that little spinning wheel thing. Like, I'm gonna think about it. So subflows. So subflows are auto-launch flows, and they can be used either I like to use them for either repeatable processes or to break up large flows. So what essentially you're doing with a subflow is creating a flow for either another record triggered screen or auto-launch flow to pass to complete something. It can either finish there or then pass back into your original flow and continue on. Again, this is perfect for people with absolutely massive flows. You want to start breaking it down and making it a little bit more user-friendly. You might have certain subflows that handle different pieces of work so that if you ever need to update them independently, you do have the capacity to do that. And when we are working with subflows, the reason that they work so well is that you do actually have the capacity to pass variables in and out of these flows. This includes, if you remember in the last session that we did, entire records. So you can pass entire record variables or collections into subflows. You can pass single IDs in order to ensure that your record is transferred from one flow to your subflow. The variable in your subflow must be set up as available for input. And if you are passing it back, it has to be set up for available to output within that subflow. So on the right-hand side here, this is just a screenshot of what it looks like when you're adding a subflow, and you can choose to pass in those few IDs. And we will be running through, we will be running through a demo of this later. So if you're still not sure, we'll check it out.
Okay, so Apex. Now you can launch a flow using Apex. You use the flow.interview class to launch an auto-launched flow, or you can use create interview. Now, Salesforce recommends that you only use create interview if you need to reuse your method or class, because the drawbacks are that if you package a class that uses the create interview, you'll have to add the associated flow manually each time. And if you delete a flow, Salesforce doesn't check if it's referenced anywhere with create interview, so it could break your code. And you can see on the right there, what does it look like? So with no namespace, you've got flow.interview.flowname, and then with a namespace, so that's in a package, you've got flow.interview.namespace.flowname, or the create interview is simply create interview and parentheses. So what does this look like? So using flow interview on the left, sorry, you can see the flow.interview.calculate accounts, and I can't calculate discounts. I can't see that one very well on my screen. Inside your method there, so my flow equals new flow.interview.calculate discounts, then your inputs. And on the right, you've got the create interview. So this looks like just putting in create interview into your flow.interview path there. You're not going to need to know how this works in your Platform App Builder cert, but you certainly need to know how do you launch a flow in Apex. Okay, so launching flows with the REST API. So you use the custom invocable action endpoint to invoke an auto-launched flow from the REST API. And you can set your values in the request body. So here I've got Workbench, and I'm putting in my endpoint in there, which is looking at, I'm already logged into my org through Workbench, and I'm looking at the flow path of create case. So create case is the name of my flow. And then in the request body, I'm putting the account ID in. So I want to create a case using the account ID. I've got to put that input in because it's in my flow. I'm using a post method here to execute that. And this is then what you would put in your code externally to launch that using the REST API. Some other ways that you can launch flows for external users. So in the Lightning community, you've got the flow component to put on a Lightning page. Your external user profile access will apply. So if they don't have access to the flow component, then you're not able to show it, or to any objects surrounding that. You can add the flow to a Visualforce page and just distribute that page externally. And you can use something called the embedded service deployment to embed a flow in an external website. So that's using HTML and JavaScript, so using code. So custom Lightning components. So the first one we're going to look at is Aura. So with our custom Lightning components, we've got Aura and Lightning web components. You can add the flow to a custom Aura component, and you distribute it in a custom action Lightning page or Lightning tab once it's created. You use the Lightning :flow component, and you add that to the Aura component. You've also, in the JavaScript controller, got to identify which flow to start. So you can see the Aura component, we're putting in the Lightning flow. So we're saying we want to use the Lightning flow in the Aura component. And in the second box there, we're saying which flow do we want to use in the code there, which I can't see the name. So I've just called it my flow in the brackets there. And then Lightning Web Components, so you're using the component JS meta.xml file, and it defines the metadata values for your component. And you need to add the Lightning flow screen target and then put your input variables in. So you can see there I've got the Lightning flow screen in the target, and then I've got my information that I'm putting into my input variables in the target config property names. Again, you're not going to need to really know how this exactly works, but you do need to know that it can be done. Okay, on to Visualforce. So with Visualforce, you're going to add the flow::interview component somewhere within the Apex page tags. you're going to need to, you need to add the API name of the flow. So make sure you've got the API name from the flow information. And then for a flow in a managed package, you're going to need to include the namespace. So that same as we were talking about before, you've got to put namespace for your flow. You also get that from the flow information. You can add the Visualforce page to your app by using a custom button link or Visualforce tab, and you can see there what it looks like. So if you're only putting your flow on the page, then it's going to look like this. So you put the flow interview name and your flow API name within the speech brackets there, within the Apex page tags. Okay, so on to user or system context. So you're able to pick whether a flow runs in user or system context. And what that means is it will take the permissions from the running user if you've selected user context, or if you select system context with sharing, it's going to enforce your record level access. But if you use without sharing, it's going to be able to access all data. So there might be some times that you need the flow to run without the actual running user's permission. So you want system permissions. And something like that might be that you want to maybe create a platform event that the user doesn't have access to, and you don't want to give the user access to that. The launch method defines whether a flow runs in that user or system context, and your launch method being Apex. So Apex is going to depend on the code. So you handle how this user or system context within the Apex code itself. Your Experience Cloud site, your Aura components, your Visualforce page components, your custom buttons, etc., they're going to default run in user context. So you need to change those to system context if you want them to run in system context. And Process Builder and Scheduled Flows will run in a system context. So what does this mean? So if the flow is running in user context, the profile and permission sets determine the object permissions and the field level access. So the permissions of your running user. The org-wide default settings, your role hierarchies, your sharing rules, your manual sharing teams and territories also determine what data is accessible. So it's your standard sharing model. And as I said, in system context, permission to access and modify all data. So it doesn't bypass the license type of the running user, but it does bypass their sharing and visibility. And by license type, so that user might not have access to something. I can't think of what it would be right now. Can you think of something, Adrienne, that might bypass the license type?
So so big flows that I built recently. So at the moment, like if you're running it as a community user that's logged in, if that community user has a profile that doesn't provide access to things like leads or campaign records, running the flow in a system context won't automatically grant them lead access to objects that their profile simply doesn't have. It's the same with platform licenses. So if you have a platform license that has a screen flow that at the end of the day is trying to create an opportunity, it still does adhere to the objects that the running user's profile would have access to. It doesn't grant them extra user licenses. It just lets them see records that sharing rules or field level security would prevent them from seeing.
Thank you. Okay, so our two system contexts, the system context with sharing. So that's going to respect your org-wide default settings, your role hierarchy, sharing rules, manual sharing, teams and territories, but it doesn't respect your object permissions, field level access, or other permissions of the running user. So it's a half system context sharing. While system context without sharing, so that's really permission to access and modify all data. And this is found inside your flow configuration properties, or when you save as, so you can click advanced and see the user or context or system context sharing options.
I was trying to find my mute. So onto flows security. So flows have their own security section. So what you can do is this kind of works, I like to say it works in the opposite way to permission sets, whereby permission sets give you extra access. What this essentially does, it has the ability to, even if you have access to flows, take the access away just for this flow and give it back to certain people. It also gives you a little bit of extra access to either run flow or manage flows there as well. So essentially what your flow security is doing is determining which profiles can run and edit particular flows. As I said, it has the ability to override the default behavior for some flows as well. So what happens is even if a user does have run and manage flow, if we've ticked the override default behavior and restrict access to enabled profiles, it means that people that would otherwise have access to that flow, if they're not within those selected profiles, it kind of just disappears. So you really do need to use this kind of sparingly and check what you're doing with it. And it can be restricted or opened up per flow. So each of these settings are obviously on a flow by flow basis. So if you just wanted to lock down one, you simply go into that particular one. I've also added a note here as well. So for brand new orgs, the run flows permission is actually removed from guest and experience cloud users or guest experience cloud users. And as of summer 22, Salesforce will actually be removing the flow user or like the run flows permission from guest and experience cloud users. So you will need to give them security to those flows to run them in order to continue running those flows if you're a guest or an experience cloud user. Unless you go into this sharing setting and update it, any existing flows that your guest user currently has access to, they'll no longer be able to access. So important if you are using flows that you're expecting guests to use, then I would definitely go in and check on these settings here.
Okay, so flow transactions. So what are flow transactions? Well, each flow interview, so that's a running instance of a flow, runs as part of an overall transaction. So a transaction is a set of operations that are executed as a single instance. And I know there's a lot of writing on this page, but we'll get to some other stuff on this one. So if one interview in a transaction fails, the whole transaction is rolled back. So that could be that not only are you running the flow in that transaction, but there might be an apex trigger or an escalation rule. And the whole thing will roll back. And governor limits are enforced in each transaction. So it's the flow plus those other interviews that are running. So apex trigger, escalation rule, validation rule, all those items are included in that one transaction and subject to governor limits. If the flow interview is one of many things happening in a transaction, the governor limits, as I said, are shared across that whole transaction. For screen flows, a new transaction begins each time the user clicks next in the screen. And with flows with pause elements, they have a different transaction for each pause. So when the flow interview does resume, a new transaction begins. So when do they start? So when the flow transactions start when, for process builder and auto launch flow, when the record is created or updated. For a flow URL, when the URL is accessed. For custom buttons or links, the button is clicked. And for visual force page, it's when the page is accessed. And for interview.start method, so that's inside Apex, it's via before or after trigger. And that's when the record is created or updated. So otherwise, it's when the method is invoked. For a REST API, it's when the call is made. For a screen, as I said, it's when next is clicked. And for pause elements, it's when the flow is resumed. And when do they end? So a screen, local action or pause element is executed, and we're going to go through local actions in the next session, or the order of execution is completed. And if you don't know what the order of execution is, then please go and read about it. It's a really important part of understanding how to develop in Salesforce. And all the interviews in the transaction have finished. So that's when the transaction will end. And those are all important to understand your governor limits and how they affect how your flow interviews and transactions run. So a few limits here. So we've got our standard 100 SQL queries issued. Total number of records retrieved by SQL is 50,000. So total number of DML statements issued is 150. Maximum CPU time on Salesforce servers is 10,000 milliseconds. So this is important when you're getting some timeouts and understanding why you're getting those timeouts. And then your total number of duplicate updates allowed in one batch is 12. And on to Adrienne for the pause element.
Thanks, Vickie. So the pause element has a relatively self-explanatory name. So the pause element allows you to pause a flow for a certain amount of time, either be it number of days based on other criteria. So it can only be triggered from an auto-launched flow. So you can't pause screen flows, you can't pause record-triggered flows. Record-triggered flows, you need to use certain timelines to do that, to effect a pause essentially. So they're only for auto-launched flows when it runs and you're telling it to wait a specific amount of time before it starts doing something else, or to wait for another action before it continues on. It looks similar to a decision element. If you remember in our last session, we went through decisions. So you can have 4 or 5 or 6. Important to note though that if it meets the condition for the first one, it's kind of like an if-else statement and won't continue on, down to see if it also needs to pause for number 2 and pause for number 3 and pause for number 4, etc. Each different pause configuration does have its own pause conditions and resume events. So what you could do is essentially go through and say, okay, if it meets this criteria, we pause it. And when this happens, we resume it. For the next one, has a different pause condition and a different resume event. Or they can all contain the same resume event if you want to. And the default path just is not a pause. So if it doesn't meet any of the criteria, it will go down the default path and just simply not pause and continue on with your flow. Next screen. So this is then resuming a pause. So what I showed you before is pause conditions, which I forgot to mention can be your standard ands, ors, or custom criteria, or it can just pause at all times as well. And then this is our resume event. So we can either choose to resume an event when a platform message is received. So this goes with Vickie's messages earlier. So a platform event can be received that will then trigger the flow to resume. Or we can either pause it for a specified time, either waiting a certain date and time, or based on a record field being updated, it can start resuming there as well. Sorry, 1 minute.
We'll just wait for Adrienne to come back. So she's going to talk about subflows now. Oh,
sorry.
I was going to say something, but you can carry on.
My dog's doing weird things. So subflows. So we alluded to this about creating them earlier on, but sort of taking a little bit more of a dive into subflows. So as we mentioned earlier, subflows can be launched from a number of different areas, but they can only specify, a subflow can either be a screen flow or an auto launch flow. So platform event triggered flows, record triggered flows cannot be subflows of anything else. They either need to have a screen or be auto launched to be included as a subflow. Also mentioned that if you want to pass information into your flow, of course, you do need to set the variables that you're passing in as an input variable. And again, if information is being passed back to make an output variable, you can't see it in the screenshot there, but we can have output variables when we come back as well. The element will always run the latest, most active version of the flow. So much like if you've got a record triggered flow and you've saved new ones and activated it, it will run the latest version. And you can actually have parent flows can have multiple subflows. So let's say we've got one big complicated screen flow and we're passing off to 4 or 5 separate subflows. Subflows can also be referenced more than once as well. So you can include a subflow in a loop if you wanted to have sort of a separate screen that captured information and continually passed it back, or if you wanted to repeat the same process further down. So you create a case in one instance, a couple of steps later it creates another case. So there's no limit on referencing the one flow multiple times in your parent flow. One thing I would try not to do though is like have a subflow that has a subflow that has a subflow. You're going to start getting into a lot of trouble.
All right, so finished behavior. So when your screen flow finishes, the user is redirected to the first screen. And you don't always want this to happen. So you can use local actions to override this. And I've said previously, we're going to cover local actions in the next session. But essentially what a local action is something like you want it to do. You want it to open a record or open a list view, or maybe you want to show a toast message, which is that message right at the top of the page, or you might want to do something like use Lightning Console, a JavaScript API to close a console tab, or there's many things that you might want to do. So you can see in this table what our default finish behavior is. So with a URL flow, it's going to start a new interview. Same with the Lightning page and the experience builder. So that's going back to your first screen. With a flow action, it's going to close the dialog and utility bar, and Lightning flow or a component in the Visualforce component is going to start a new interview. Okay. Debugging.
Awesome. So with flows, you can of course debug them from within the flow window. This is perfect while you're creating the flow if you want to test that it works. But what it's also perfect for is if someone comes to you afterwards and says, hey, why didn't my record update? Or why didn't this flow trigger on this particular record? What you can actually do is debug it after the fact and simulate that change for that record. So test and see where it hit and why it didn't make it all the way down, or maybe what would have happened with it. So it does simulate the actual running of the flow. However, you can see that there's a checkbox checked there when you debug it that actually allows you to run the flow in rollback mode while you debug it. So if we remember last session, Vickie talked about rollback mode. Essentially, it means that if there are any commits to the database while a debug is running, so creating records, updating records, it does roll those changes back afterwards. So you're not just testing everything and updating all the records at all times. Depending on the type of flow that you are running the debug for, I don't know what I wrote, Rich Oath. Clearly I did this really late at night. That's supposed to say which path to run. So if you have scheduled paths and you do want to run a debug on, say, a schedule, you can choose that you want it to run the immediate one, or you want it to run that's supposed to trigger in 7 days, so you can see if it would have eventually triggered. You can set input variables. So in the instances where you had multiple input variables, you can specify IDs, or you can specify the record that you want to run it on if it is something like a record triggered flow. You can also choose to skip any starting condition requirements. Again, if it is a record triggered flow, or it is like a platform event triggered flow, you can choose to just have it not wait for those things and see what would have happened. You can choose, so for those flows that are either on create or update, you can choose to simulate the flow if the record was created in that instance, or if the record was updated, if you've got different paths for things like is changed or if it was brand new. You can choose to run the flow as another user as well. I use this a lot when I'm testing out community users running flows to make sure they have permissions so that I don't need to do the whole find their contact and log into the experience and go back and forth all of the time. And again, you do have that option to roll back any of those changes. You can actually untick that in certain instances as well, and the changes will commit to the database. This is perfect for things like scheduled flows, where if you don't want to wait for the schedule for it to run, you go into debug mode, untick, run it and roll back, and just click run, and it will actually commit all of those changes, and it simulates that flow running without needing to wait for the scheduled date or time. So that's always important to note as well. I found that one out yesterday when I had to force something to run. And when you're running debug logs, after the debug has finished executing, you will be able to see the results that pop up in the right-hand side panel. So the image to the most right, you can see how a debug log would return. So mine in particular here, what was happening is I was creating a case. I'd passed a whole heap of variables in. I was adding it to an assignment ready to update. And then I was running the create case record. So we can see that it's ready to be created, and then it finished successfully. If there were errors, they would pop up. And each element that you've added to your flow will pop up as a separate kind of drop-down section. So you can see what's happening within each element of your flow. Cool. We've got monitoring flows. So Vickie and I went a little back and forth as to whether we added this slide in yesterday, because what happens is that we did cover off last session how to see your scheduled and failed flow interviews. And that's whereby if you've got like a time-based workflow or someone has paused a flow, you can go to the paused and waiting flow interviews page and see when they're scheduled to resume and what interviews they're going to be using. So we weren't going to cover that off this session, but there are some additions to monitoring flows that we did want to include. And that's this new automation homepage. Now it is running in beta, but will appear in your Salesforce org. And this automation homepage will show you how many peak paused flow interviews you have, how many total flow interviews you're running, how many total flows you're running with the UI. And it also gives you a nice little place to start learning about it, connecting with the community, starting automation templates and diving in a little bit more. Vickie, if you go to the next screen, we continue on, and it will actually measure all of the flows that are being created in your org as well. So you can start seeing how many flows have errored out, or if you have a lot of erroring flows, which one's erroring more, how many screen flows have been completed in the last 30 days, what the average completion time of a flow is, and then the bottom right-hand side, the total started automations by process type. So we can see there, I picked this for a customer of mine, and they're in user acceptance testing at the moment. So they have 1.6 million times that we've auto-launched a flow. We've been running user acceptance testing over the last month. So it's probably a really poor example compared to the 379 times that we've run a screen flow. But it's some really good insights into what your flows are, how long they're taking, and sort of any analytics that you want there. And they are just reports, and you can actually drill down into that information. The screenshot was cut off there, but you are able to start drilling down into some of those as well.
Okay, so do you want me to cover view triggered flows? So this is a new option in one of this year's releases. So you're actually able to look at your triggered flows, and these are the ones that run on save or create, update, etc., or even platform event. To access this, you need to enable it in your process automation settings, and then you just go to your flow screen and drop down the list view to select triggered flows. So it's a nice little tool that just allows you to see what is actually happening on record changes in your org. Okay, so error handling, and I'm going to try and go through this fairly quickly because we're once again running out of time. So when an error occurs in the flow, you're going to get this really awesome unhandled fault has occurred in this flow, and unhandled fault has occurred while processing the flow. It means nothing to us. So we want to look at what do you do for error handling. So when they get this flow, the flow can't proceed or return to a previous part of the flow. The admin will get who created the flow is going to get the fault email. The email details the element that failed, the error message for the flow, the element, and which elements were executed during the failed flow. And a flow execution error event platform message. So platform event message is going to be created for screen flows. I'll cover that off in another slide. So our default options are adding a fault path. So you can add an element for your error handling. And you can see in the right here, we've got a get records and a create records. And then we've got a fault. So the fault path allows us to say, what should we do if there is an error in this flow? When you drag your second connection point for a standard element to a new element, it's going to automatically put that fault path in. So a tip here that Adrienne taught me the other day, or told me the other day, is when you've got a screen error. So if you want a screen error to pop up in your flow for your user, or even if it's an email error, that you should name it a name or a error number, so that when your user tells you they're getting an error, they're able to then tell you that number, and you can immediately see which part of the flow they're getting the error in. Okay.
That saved my butt a many time when you have about 20 screens in one screen flow and there's like an update action in between and they say it's erroring and you have to work out where.
Yeah, it's a really good
Just
tip.
easy to get an error code like A7423 and you just look for the screen element named A7423 and work out what was before it.
Yeah. All right, so you can customize the error message. So we'll go through some ways that you can error handle. So you can create a text template resource with a better error message than that fault occurred message from Salesforce. And so how you do this in your flow, you're going to add a screen element for your fault path, and you'll use a display text component inside your screen, your display text element. With the display text body, and you can put it whatever you want in there. So you can have a funny message or a non-funny message, or however you want to handle your flow and your users. So sending yourself an email. So again, you just configure an action element to send yourself an email. And this is a good when you've got that error message or that Adrienne suggested, where you're putting in a code, you'll be able to see where it's come from by using that screen element name or an element name or error code name. So we've also got this standard Salesforce flow execution error event platform event that is created for screen flows. Our restrictions with this is that only flows and process builders can subscribe to it, so no Apex triggers. And that means that when a platform event is created for this, so the flow execution error event, we can only do something with flow or process builder. So we can create a platform event triggered flow or process builder, but we can't use this in code. And we need to define the criteria and create an action. So what do we want to do? We might want to create a chatter post or send an email or something else when that platform event occurs. Our other option is that we create our own custom platform event. So this will allow us to handle the error through the fault connector, do what we want to do, not just receive an error. So you might want to actually do something rather than just throw up an error. It's going to display a user-friendly message, so you could display a user-friendly message rather than the Salesforce standard flow error message. You can log more data, so you're going to be able to log all available details, like the error message, the record details, the flow information that isn't created in our standard platform event created by Salesforce. You can also allow an Apex trigger to subscribe to the event to do something. But also remember to consider your government limits. These are included. So a published event consumes 1 DML, and you're going to need to make sure that you consider that in your transactions. So what else could you do? So with error handling, it really depends on your flow and what errors you expect to or are receiving. So things like, can the flow continue without the intervention? Can the user correct any errors? Should a task or case be created? Is that what we're wanting to do? Can you anticipate any errors happening? Could you use validation rules prior to ensure required fields are populated before the flow is run? Can you check in your flow whether that required data is available? So you might want to check if specific fields are populated. You might not want them to be mandatory on your page layouts or in a validation rule, but you might want them to be mandatory inside your flow. And consider using that platform event and also an error log custom object for some error handling so that you're able to see exactly what's happening. You can look back if you've got an error log custom object to understand what errors have been occurring with specific flows. Some examples are, so you might ignore the error. You can do that sometimes. You can add the fault path connector to the same element as the normal connector. You can log an error in a custom object using your create records element. So that's when I was talking about maybe putting the error into a log custom object. You could create a case using the create records element. You could use your validation rules to make sure that fields are entered. And you can check if fields are populated using a decision element. So I've got a few flows where I'm looking at fields and I'm actually displaying a screen to say, can you make sure that your fields are populated before the flow continues? And I'll be doing that in my demo, which will be next session. So you can request corrections from users in a screen flow if the data that is entered isn't needed in your flow. All right, on to bulkification. So what is it? So bulkification is where you perform similar actions together. So that is like you want one operation to create 50 records rather than 50 operations to create one record each. And we do this because of the multi-tenant environment and we want to help avoid our governor limits. But the really good news is that for the most part, bulkification is automatic in flows. And I'll show you how that works. So flows will bulkify, meaning that they will get to a certain element within your flow and stay there and wait for every other record to catch up to it if you've got more than one record that you're working with. So the flow bulkify any element that performs a DML statement or a SQL query or does something else external to the flow like sending an email, like an action. Legacy API actions are not bulkified, so please keep that into account, but there is an Apex action you can use that is. So our elements that create, update, or delete records, these are our DML statements. So that's create, update, delete, our quick actions, our post to chatters, submit for approval, core actions, and our Apex action elements, and that depends on your org. And elements that look up records, so these are our SQL queries. So it's get records, update records, delete records, and Apex action elements again. And also elements that send emails. So that's our send email core action, email alert element, and our Apex action elements again. All right, so how does this work? So we've got a little diagram here thanks to Salesforce. I stole it from them, and there's a link at the bottom there of where you can look more at this more. So imagine we've got 100 records that are going through this flow in one transaction. So the first interview goes through one, which is our get records. Because it's a get records action, it can be bulkified. So the interview will wait there until all other interviews, so all other records, have done the same. And then Salesforce will execute all the get records operations there together in one DML statement. The first interview is then evaluated by 2, which is our decision element. So in this case, if there's more than 5 cases, the interview will route down the more than 5 path, and the interview proceeds to the second get records element, which is our 3A. And because that is a get records element, it's bulkifiable, so the interview waits there. If there's 5 cases or less, the interview is routed down the 5 or fewer path. Number 4, so is our notify account core action, and it's also bulkifiable, so the interview waits there. After all the interviews have been processed, let's say 30 are waiting to execute the get records 3 element and 70 are waiting to execute the post to chatter action, then Salesforce will execute all of the get records element at 3A for those 30 interviews together. Instead of 30 separate SQL queries, we're going to give one query. And then the transaction returns to number 4, the post to chatter action, and the actions are executed all together. So instead of 70 DML statements, it's going to be 1. And the final part is of 3B is another post to chatter action. Again, because it's bulkifiable, the interview will wait there until it can execute all those 30 post-chatter operations together that have come from the 3A get records element.
Vickie, we've just had a question come through. It says, what happens if the get record element returns, for example, like 50,000 records?
Okay, so I can't recall the limits off the top, but it's going to be subject to limits. So as long as you're within limits, do you recall the limit for that, Adrienne? I think SOC was, no, I have to go back and look
I
at the
feel
limits.
like it's 150 DML statements in one go.
Yeah,
Like I'm also making that up, so
yeah, it's 150 DML, but it's more SOCL.
I'm more
Um,
so.
yeah, I'll have when Adrienne's doing the demo, I'll go back and have a look at the number, but it's limited by Salesforce governor limits. Okay, so what else can you do? So there are things that you can do to make sure that your flows are bulkified. So don't run SOCL queries or DML statements inside a loop. For SOCL queries, put them in record collections before the loop and then have the loop run on those record collections. And for DML statements, you're going to use assignment elements and record collection variables again. And so you're going to assign your updates into assignment elements, and then you're going to run DML after the loop for the record collection and then update element or create element or delete. All right, and we're on to our demo. Now, do you want to take over presenting, Mads?
That was quick. Yes, yes, I will.
And just a note, everyone, we are going to an hour and a half today, if you're wondering why we're doing a demo at 4 minutes to time. So, but this will be recorded, so if you can't stay, you can catch up later.
Yeah. Just leave it on this screen for a second so that I can sort of run through it. If we do finish early, of course, we won't hold you all around. This demo probably won't take half an hour, so we'll see how we go with it. But what I wanted to do is show the use case of a subflow within Salesforce and why you would be using a subflow. So in this particular scenario here, we have Salesforce's favorite fictitious organization, Universal Containers. Universal Containers have a number of different processes in which they need to create a case within flows. Now, Universal Containers is also fans of creating system fields or default values for their cases when they go through based on certain case types. And at the moment, because they have a number of record triggered flows, it means that every time they add a new custom field or they want to change the default priority of their cases when they're creating them, they need to go into each and every flow that has a create case element in it and make the changes accordingly. So what I'm going to show you today is instead how you could reuse a subflow to simply pass off to that in order to create the case and then pass back to the original flow to continue on, essentially. So Vickie, if you wanted to stop sharing and I will start sharing. And Vickie will also do some quick investigation to see if we can find the answer to that particular question. About 1 million mosquitoes in my house at the moment to present. Should change to this slide and start presenting it. So Vickie, I apologize, but I'm just stealing your flow from last week and I'm going to show how we can change it slightly. So for those of you that saw the demo that was uploaded on our YouTube channel that the wonderful Vickie did last week before, after our session, this was an example of a screen flow that was capturing information, creating a case record, and then making a decision and posting to Chatter after the fact. Now, let's say we have all of these different records and maybe they're on 10 different objects. So one of them is unique to accounts. There's then a screen flow that's unique to contacts, a screen flow that's unique to donations, a screen flow that's unique to opportunities, etc. But as a result, they all need to create case element in it, and only a few variables need to differ. So we can see for this particular one here, Vickie has had her create records element directly inside of her flow. Now, this isn't an issue for anything at all. This is perfectly fine to have a create case element in here, but what we wanted to show is how we can kind of pass this off to another flow, have another flow create this case, and then pass the record back and then evaluate it. So you can see here we're passing all sorts of things through into here. So what we've done is we've created this very simple auto-launched create a case flow. In this create a case flow, we have a couple of different just text variables that are set for available for input. I can see I've got account ID, case type, contact ID, description, and subject. So what it means is when we pass into this one, we're able to pass through values from the triggering flow into these, and they're the ones that it will use to create this case. So rather than having to set them each individually, every time this flow runs, it's going to be dynamic dependent on which parent flow is passing in the data. I also have our kind of single record variable here, which I actually think I renamed a second ago from case placeholder to new case or something like that, and maybe I forgot to save. And then I have the two elements, prepare case and create case record. So how does this work, or what does it look like? So in the first step, where we have our assignment, what we're doing, I forgot to click a good new there, is we're preparing the case for creation and storing it in like a temporary resource. So I haven't actually created the record at this time. I'm storing an assignment ready to create it. In here, we can see that for this resource or case placeholder, which is the name of our record when we're going to pass it back out, we're then setting the subject, description, account ID, contact ID, and case type based on the variables that were passed in from the parent flow. But there's also a few variables here that, because of the way universal containers works, they want set as defaults every time they create a case record. So the status should always be new, the origin should always be flow, and the priority should always be medium. So again, this means that if all of a sudden universal containers decided to change their default case priority to low when it was created via a flow, they just come into the one subflow, update it to low, and then it will apply to all of the parent flows and all of the parent objects that pass through to it, rather than having to go into like 5 or 10 flows and change the default value to low. So this is then our assignment here. Just added a new field in, so I'm going to create a new version. After we've prepared the case record for creation, we're then going to go through and create our case placeholder record. One thing that I did do here is also with our case placeholder record, I made it available for output. So what that now means is after our case placeholder has been created, I can pass that entire record back out from the flow that triggered it. So we can start evaluating what's happened as a result of this case creating. Now, you might have thought, okay, well, you've got it available for output, but at no point are we actually setting an ID throughout this. So how does it actually pass the full case back through? When you're creating an assignment, it's very specific to leave the ID blank. And we can see in this create case record element here, where we're creating one case and we're using the values from that record, that we need to make sure the ID is blank. And then after the flow creates, it actually updates that case placeholder record with the ID of the case that was created. So that's then stored on that record variable, so that when we pass it back out, that entire record ID inclusive is there. So what I'm going to do is then activate this new version of my flow and show you what it looks like to now add this as a subflow. And so to do that, I'm going to go back to Vickie's original flow. And because she's done wonderful work and I appreciate it, I'm going to save it as a brand new flow. And then simply come through here and change our create case record. And instead, I'm going to drag the I don't drag anymore, I use auto layouts. I drag the subflow element into the screen. We then want to search for the flow that we're going to reference. So this is based on both the name and API name of the flow so that you can see it there. We pick a label, so we might call it launch create case subflow, and then we can start passing variables in as well. So we've then got like our account ID, our case type, our description, and our subject. And we can choose how we're going to be passing each of those out. So Vickie had stored variables for some of these before. So our account ID is going to be the ID of the account that's being passed in from the screen flow. Our case type variable is going to be the case type from our screen. A contact will be passed through. And then we can pass through our description and our subject from the screen flow that we've added in here. We can then go through and connect these particular items back up and simply save this version. And if we choose to activate it, what that means now is that it's going to continue on exactly the same as it was before, except instead of using the create case element, it's going to pass off to this subflow to create the case and then pass back, and we can continue making any decisions and chatter posts that are needed. One thing that I did just notice though is that it wasn't passing this out the way I thought it would. That's cool. That's troubleshooting 101 for Adrienne. So that means then that, as I mentioned before, if we've got, contact create case, opportunity create case, lead create case, they can have different screen elements and start capturing different information. We can then just pass to our subflow to create the case and send it back. Now, in essence here with our prepare case assignment, even though we are passing in an account and a contact ID, let's say we were using this in the instance of like an opportunity or things like that, we can still continue to pass through these variables. So long as the fields aren't mandatory in your Salesforce org, it will just pass a null value into them and it won't fail to create afterwards. So this is essentially using our subflow element to handle the creation of this case and then pass back. What I will then show you as well here is what that looks like since we've got some spare time when we did want to go through and debug it, because I was cautious that it's not actually passing that case placeholder back through unless it is, and I've just missed it entirely. But I don't think it was passing it back in. Case record type list, you have case ID and everything like that. So I am cautious that Vickie's decision that decides whether the case type was electronic or not might fail. But I have also just realized that she is selecting it in the support type here. So we should be fine. So if we did decide to run through and debug this flow now, just to make sure before I save and activate it, that it is going to do what we planned or what we were hoping it would do, I come in and I select debug. These are the options that we saw earlier. So we can run the latest version of the flow, show it, and because of the org settings, we can't run the flow as another user, but we can start setting some of these input variables. So I'm going to go through and select Edge Communications as my account. And I can then simulate the run of this flow. So we go in, pick our contact, enter in subject, description, and proceed to the next screen, where we can then continue to enter in additional information. And as I'm going through here, we can start seeing on the right-hand side everything that was committed and everything that was passing. So we can see at the moment it's successfully passed in that account ID. So step 1, check, we're all there. Step 2, we're setting some of these variables so we can see that subject is being set, description is being set, and the contact is being set. So now we can continue on with our sales support and marketing. Pick our different case types and case reasons, products, priorities, and statuses. Again, because we're setting some defaults for these, we could potentially remove some of these from the flow. and then click next, and whoop, an error has occurred. And yeah, that error has occurred, like I said, because with Vickie's previous case, we were using the case ID. So it was actually setting a variable when that case record was created. So we know that this is going to error. And instead of using that case ID field, we'd simply need to then go through and create that with our new case record that was passed back from our subflow. So I think that's a perfect example of how debugging can help you before you activate, just to make sure it's not going to error out on you there. If that did go through and pass, what you would then see is this particular one here being set to post to chatter and then being successfully committed to the database. So we can see at the end, because this was a non-committal flow, it does roll back. So that case that I created as a result of the subflow has now been rolled back. So is any other updates that we may have been making to these records as well.
So you can see here what error the user is going to see on the screen when they get an error. And while this might be a specific flow error, they get this error as well unless you put your error handling in. And there's no error handling in this flow. It was a simple demo flow to show how to create a flow. So we could put error handling in here to handle something like that by putting in another screen to say what the error was.
Yeah. So because I'm a stickler for, got some time left, what that would essentially look like is we can come in here, we can add a screen in, we can maybe call it our error screen. Again, if there was a specific message that we did want to add, we could go through and do that. We can then drag our display text element in, give it a name. A new keyboard, and I'm clearly clicking the tab key instead of the caps lock key. This is where Vickie was mentioning that we could put like an error code in it. So instead of going to go through in a place where you have multiple messages, you could rename your screen element something like error screen C001. And that way, when a user hits the error message, it'll say, give your admin error code C001, and you'll know exactly what had happened before it. So if we went through here and say we wanted to have our error screen based off this particular chatter post here, we would simply drag a new line from our chatter post to our error screen, and that becomes our fault line. So if something happens here and there is an error that has occurred, it will pass directly to our error screen instead of continuing on. So if I went through now and saved that and tried to debug it in the same scenario, we'll enter in the exact same variables as we did yesterday, edge communication, yesterday, 5 minutes ago. And click next. We can now see that other than that instead of that unattractive error message that didn't really give our user a helpful error, they now get the whoops, something's wrong, give your admin an error code. Now you could get a little bit more creative with this, and if you're handling it and you know exactly what's gone wrong, you could choose to actually display on your screen to your user what's gone wrong so that they can click the previous button and go back and fix it before continuing on. But essentially, error handling really just gives you a better error message for your users. Our fault lines can also then be, as Vickie mentioned, do like email actions and other actions for you as well. But this is just an example of what adding a fault line and doing a custom error message for your fault handling does look like. That was pretty much all I had to run through on that particular demo. Does anyone have any questions or about, flows, subflows, error messages, or things that you would have liked to see? Calling that 3 seconds of silence. Awesome.
And just going back over that limits question before. So I've just put it in the chat, but the limits for the SQL queries within your one transaction is 50,000. So that's for all SQL queries within the transactions and not just that one element. But if that one element was the only one, then if you've got 50,000 returned, then it'll work. But if that's not, or if it's 50,001, the transaction, including the flow, is going to fail, and the entire transaction will roll back. Now, I do know, and I haven't done it, that there is a way to count that so that you handle errors inside the flow. So if you wanted to know about that, you could have a look around to see how do you do that? How do you count SQL queries so that you're not reaching that limit? But as I said, I've not done it. I've just read about it.
Yeah. I guess in the instance of the exact scenario that Vickie was talking about as well, if you do start to have 50,000 records returning in one thing from one parent, you've probably got bigger issues than processing it in one go. And we're starting to talk about data skew and things like that.
True.
So you'd hope that you'd hit data skew before you started to hit some of those. So some tips and best practices. So some of these, I think we've just continued this on from the last session, but some of these have been updated. So tips and best practices, I know I said this last session, but half of these really feel like a list of things that I just don't do. But essentially, before you go, plan out your flow, plan what it looks like. I'm one of those people that adds an element and then has to think about what my next element looks like. Which is why I need to run in debug mode all of the time. Always build your flows in a test environment first. And in saying that, even before you save, if you're building in a test environment that's widely used, before you activate your flow, always run it in debug mode just to make sure it's going to do what you want it to do before activating it. Because the moment you activate it, you'll probably get users coming back to you if it's widely used saying, oh, but I'm getting this unhandled error. And you're probably going to have to deactivate it and debug it anyway. So a good best practice there is to run those debugs before you even activate your flow, just to make sure it looks like it's going to be okay. Don't do database changes, do database changes at the end of your flow, if possible. So ideally, don't commit changes inside of a loop, and also don't do multiple commits throughout. That's what the assignment feature is for. So you can go back to our previous session if you wanted to see it. But essentially, in place of where you might have been using 4 or 5 different, update records, you could simply use an assignment, and then at the end of your flow, just do one bulk update to that record. Don't do DML statements inside of a loop. So especially don't create cases inside of a loop. Instead, or create records inside of a loop. Instead, use an assignment, add the record to a collection, and then use that collection after the loop to then create your records. Document your flows so that someone other than you knows what's going on inside them, but also 6 months later when you've forgotten what you've built, you know what you've built. It's the equivalent of adding comments into your code. It helps a lot at the end of the day, but also including your documentation, add descriptions into your flows. There is that description field for each variable, each screen flow, each create record action. If it's going to help you, add a description in for things. Don't just keep going through and hoping you'll remember. Provide error handling and creating that fault path. So that section that we just showed you, honestly, it's going to save you a lot of time having to fish through, especially if you're someone like me that has a shared inbox where all the flow errors go to. If a customer tells you something has errored out and you just want to search for the unhandled error email, it's a lot. use before save flows for fast field updates for the same record. So if you want a record to be created and updated in the same transaction or updated without using additional DML statements, the fast field updates and before save flows are perfect for this. Consider using those subflows for repeatable content or for large flows to break them up so that you're not staring at a big wall, especially with the new auto layout flows, and you've got to keep dragging and dragging and dragging down the screen to find something. Subflows can save you a lot of time there. Save often is a big one that I probably do all of the time. Every time I debug, I save. Every time I add a screen, I save. It just means that you're not, don't risk losing the flow if at times you add or erroring you. It also means that, God forbid, if someone's in there trying to edit your flow at the same time as you are, they get the most recent version if they go through and open it, but ideally they shouldn't. Use a get element to find your record or record type IDs instead of hard coding them. So some people will hard code record type IDs in a flow when you're going to create a record. So they might say this case record ID should be this particular 18 digits. If you deploy, there is a very high possibility that if you're deploying that record type ID changes and that flow stops working. So you can use a get element, and record type is actually an object that you can get, where you can then specify what your S object is, for example, case, and what the developer name of the record type that you want to be using is. And last but not least, check out the Trailhead trail on building flows with Flow Builder. There's some really good hands-on stuff, some really good questions and answer type things, but it's also a great place to start learning and continue learning with Flow as well. Vickie, any other tips and best practices that you've got up your sleeve?
Not that I can think of, and I must change that don't do DML statements inside of a loop to don't do SQL queries and DML statements inside a loop.
Yes.
But no, nothing else.
Beforehand. Do you get, pass through a collection, add it to a process loop, and then go out.
All right, so if there's no more questions, we're done for the session.
So reminder that we do have our third and final flow session next week. So our second advanced flow session. It will also be Ladies Be Architects' last study session of the year before we head off on some holiday leave. So as a refresher for those of you who wanted to see what we will be covering next week, we're going to be looking at stages, actions and recommendations and next best actions, local flows. We're going to take a deeper dive into platform events and Apex actions within flows. We're going to look at how we integrate those with external systems, what API versions are. We're going to take a much deeper dive into limits and considerations, Flow Orchestrator, more tips and best practices, and then Vickie's going to take us through a demo of a platform event triggered flow, I believe. Is that
yes? Yep. And hopefully a pause.
Hopefully a pause. Awesome. So without anything else, thank you all so much for joining this afternoon, this evening, tonight, wherever in the world you are. If you do have any questions at all, please feel free to reach out to Vickie or myself. We'll be happy to answer them for you. Otherwise, we hope to see you at the next session next week, and keep an eye out for this recording on our YouTube channel. Have a great day and evening, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.
Bye.